country much more secure. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has revealed the vulnerability that our dependence on oil creates for our economy and for average Americans trying to fill up their cars and pay their heating bills. The fact is the United States has sufficient domestic production to meet our energy needs today. We're producing more oil and refined product than ever before. Oil production was up more than 500,000 barrels a day from January to December of last year, and it's expected to rise even more this year. Mr. President, I've noticed the arrival of Senator Hawley, and I think we're both prepared at this point for me to make a unanimous consent request, and I'd like to do so now. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations. Calendar numbers 599, 477, 472, that the nominations be confirmed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and that no further motions be in order to the nominations, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I want to say at the outset that it's always a privilege to work with Senator Reid and on the Armed Services Committee and every capacity where we get to work together, and I look forward to that going forward. What we are being asked to do, what the Senate is being asked to do today, however, is to fast-track nominees for leadership positions in the Department of Defense to carry out a foreign policy that is manifestly failing. This administration is careening from one crisis to another, endangering the security of the American people, endangering the security of the world. The Senator mentioned just a moment ago the situation in Ukraine. You don't have to look any further than there to see the crisis, the latest crisis that the Biden administration has led this nation into. To begin with, the administration failed to deter Vladimir Putin and his Russian invasion before it happened. They failed to actually check Putin when it would have really mattered. How did they do this? Well, for starters, when President Biden came to office, he opened up Russia's pipelines, and he shut down America's pipelines. He handed our energy independence that the Senator was just mentioning, he handed our energy independence away. He gave it away. And who stepped in to fill the void? The Russians. What is Russia? It's not so much a country as it is a gas station. And Putin is pumping and pumping and pumping. What is financing his war in Ukraine? It is not least our energy policies that are giving away our energy independence, giving away our energy dominance, and greenlighting his energy production. That's what Joe Biden did when he first came to office, greenlighting his production, shutting down our production. But what else? President Biden had the opportunity to provide lethal military aid to Ukraine last spring. When the Ukrainians first requested it, he said no. In fact, I believe he said no repeatedly for much of the year last year. That turns out to have been a very poor decision. Now, today, deterrence having failed, the Russians engaged in illegal invasion of a sovereign nation, threatening the stability of Europe, the security of Europe, and of course endangering our own national security. And what is the president doing? What is President Biden doing? Is he turning back on American energy production? Is he sanctioning the Russian energy sector? No. Just today, finally, he was dragged kicking and screaming to finally agree that this country will no longer import Russia's blood oil. Remember, he had us importing over 670,000 barrels of Russian oil every single day. Today, he announced finally, belatedly, we won't do that anymore. But what's he doing instead? He's going to every petty dictator on the face of the map and begging them to make up the difference. We learned that the president's team has been in touch with Maduro's regime, the murderous Maduro regime in Venezuela, and is preparing to offer them a special package that will ease the restrictions, ease the sanctions, ease the punishment on that outlaw regime, and get them to make up the difference in oil production from Russia. We learned that the president is potentially planning a trip to Saudi Arabia to ask the Saudis to increase their oil production to make up the difference from the Russians. I wonder if the topic of Jamal Khashoggi will come up in those meetings. I certainly hope it will. President Biden once said that he would make Saudi Arabia pay the price, I'm quoting him, and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. I guess that's no longer the policy of the United States government, because here's what we are reduced to under this administration. We are reduced to begging our enemies, the dictators of the world, we're reduced to begging them to bail out a foreign policy that is failing. Not least because this administration will not allow American workers to turn on American energy. I take it from the president's remarks and from the president's policy that he has no objection in principle to pumping more oil and gas. Apparently he doesn't, so this can't be about climate change. He's fine with more oil production, but not in this country. Not by American workers. Heaven forbid American workers be get put back to work. Heaven forbid American workers actually earn more. Heaven forbid the American people be able to pay less at the pump as Joe Biden's prices drive gas prices through the roof. Now, this is the policy of weakness, fecklessness that this president's given us. And let's not forget where it began. It began with Afghanistan. And that's the reason I'm here on the floor today in particular. It has been months since the fall of Afghanistan. This administration has lost 2 nations in the space of barely 6 months. The Afghanistan debacle is the worst foreign policy debacle in this country's history since Vietnam, although stay tuned, the way this administration is going. And what has this Congress done about it? Who has been held accountable for it? I've come to this floor over and over and over to ask for accountability. Has someone been fired? No. Has someone been relieved of duty? No. Now, I was here just a few weeks ago after the Washington Post reported on a 2,000-page investigation done by Central Command into the fall of Afghanistan. Since that time, my team and I have been through all 2,000-plus pages. And I'd just like to point out, Mr. President, that we learned about this investigative report not from a hearing conducted by this body, but from an investigative report by a newspaper. I'm glad somebody has some interest in what happened in Afghanistan. Sadly, it seems not to be this chamber. But here are some of the things that we've learned in this 2,000-page investigative report about Afghanistan. We learned from General Scott Miller, who was the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan in early 2021, that he was extremely worried from May the 2nd onward as he saw key districts fall. And in fact, General Miller testified to us that he warned Secretary Austin and General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as early as March or April, that the Afghan security forces might collapse rapidly once we withdrew forces. And now this report documents it and says, indeed, there is evidence that he was very worried, that he was warning the collapse of Afghanistan would come quickly. He was warning that it would be imminent. But what did the Biden administration do? Did they order the evacuation of our civilians? Did they plan for the possible fall of the Afghan government? No. The report goes on to detail that the National Security Council and the State Department showed a total lack of urgency right up until the final hours before the fall of Kabul. We learned that Rear Admiral Peter Vaisley, who took over for General Miller last spring and commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan during the final stages of the withdrawal, provided assessments weeks before the fall of Kabul that the trajectory of Afghanistan was in a downward spiral, this is a quote from the report, and was likely not recoverable. The report goes on to say this: Rear Admiral Vaisley was trying to get the ambassador to see the security threat for what it really was. There were as many as 10 districts falling every day, getting closer and closer to Kabul. The embassy needed to position for withdrawal, but the ambassador didn't get it. Mr. President, these are just a few of the details in this 2,000-page report showing that our military commanders warned over and over and over that Kabul was on the verge of collapse, that the security dangers were mounting, that civilians needed to be evacuated, that we needed to change course, and this administration did nothing. What happened as a result? 13 service members dead, including one from my own state. I will never forget talking to his family, his father, less than 48 hours after this young man, Lance Corporal Jared Schmitz, lost his life, along with 12 others who bravely served this country, giving the uttermost of their devotion. But, Mr. President, it didn't have to be that way. Here's my point. This body should be hearing from these commanders, from these men and women who have testified in this report, who have given evidence about what happened in Afghanistan. We should be hearing from them in public under oath. No more private briefings, no more closed session briefings. We should hear from Secretary Austin. We should hear from General Milley. We should hear from the commanders, General Miller, under oath. They should come and testify about this report. We should do our job, and until we do, I will not consent to allow the Senate to bypass regular order and fast-track the nominations of yet more leadership positions to continue carrying on a failed policy. I will not do it. There's a crisis in Ukraine. There's a crisis in Afghanistan. Crises multiply across the world at the hands of this administration, and still this Congress refuses to reverse course and refuses to provide the most basic oversight that it is charged with providing. I don't think it is too much to ask in the face of this, in the face of these disasters, that we have the curiosity to at least have an open hearing, to at least ask who should be accountable and what should be done. And so I want to say again, I appreciate Senator Reid's earnestness on this issue. I appreciate the fact that he doesn't control the floor. My final point, Mr. President, is I would note that last week, as I look toward the clock here, last week, if my memory serves, of the 4 days that we were in session, we took a total of 4 votes in the United States Senate last week. We could have voted, if these nominees were as important as they say they are, we could have voted last week. We could have voted earlier today. Now, Senator Reid doesn't control the floor, but I might just note to the majority leader that maybe instead of taking a vacation tomorrow, which I gather is the plan, that maybe the Senate ought to be here and working. And maybe we ought to be here and voting, because until there is some accountability for what happened in Afghanistan, for what is happening with this administration's foreign policy, I'm going to ask the Senate to observe regular order and do its job and to vote. With that, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I think one of the messages that the senator from Missouri was trying to convey was do our job. And one of our fundamental jobs is to review, vote upon, and confirm or not confirm nominees to critical positions in the Department of Defense. And this effort has completely frustrated that goal of doing our job. We have seen repeatedly blockage of nominees that are fully qualified, forcing votes, and the gentleman from Missouri is talking about we should have had votes this week, forcing votes because 1 or 2 people object, and of course the final outcome is 90 votes, 85 votes in favor of the nominee. The will of the Senate was very clear. These people should be in their office doing their jobs, helping us maintain our security, not subject to the whims and the wills of 1 or 2 people. The civilian nominees I just referred to are 3 individuals with critical positions within the Department of Defense. The Armed Services Committee held hearings on all 3 of these nominations months ago, and all 3 were reported out of the committee by voice vote, unanimously. No one objected. I'm unaware of any objection to these nominees relating to their qualifications for the positions which they've been nominated for. And I need not remind my colleagues that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its war of choice against a modern functioning democracy, how critical it is to have people in place in the Department of Defense. It's very difficult to complain about the policy of administration when there's been a deliberate attempt for more than a year to delay critical nominees from taking a position in that department. And more importantly, I think, this is a trend that was observed by the Commission on National Defense Strategy under President Trump. It said the implementation of National Defense Strategy must feature empowered civilians fulfilling their statutory responsibilities, particularly regarding issues of force management, strong civilian oversight is a central hallmark of U.S. civil-military relations, codified in the Constitution, embraced throughout the nation's history. And what is frustrating that? Actions like today, where fully qualified individuals, passed by voice vote through the committee, are held up. If there is a weakness, and it's been identified by other sources in the National Defense Strategy at the Department of Defense, it is, in one case, the lack of sufficient civilian leadership and continuity. And that's exactly what this action today will continue to foster. For example, Mr. Ashish Vazirani was reported out of the committee on December 8th, and he would become the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, the #2 official in the department in charge of military and personnel policy and the readiness of our armed forces. Mr. Alex Wagner was reported out of the committee in October of last year, and he would become the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, the senior official within the Department of the Air Force with responsibility for military and civilian personnel policy and the readiness of Air Force and Space Force personnel. Ms. Rachel Jacobson was reported out of the committee in October of last year, and she would become the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Energy, Installation, and the Environment. She will be responsible for managing the Army's physical footprint, and in particular, she will oversee contracts that will increase installation resilience and a modernization of Army infrastructure, particularly in regard to energy, which is one of the issues that we are talking about with great emphasis today and in the preceding several weeks. All of these positions are critically important to the Department of Defense. And again, I'm unaware of any substantive objection to these nominees on the basis of their qualifications. The sooner they assume their offices, the better for the Department's ability to tackle these challenges in behalf of service members and their families. And I also think it's important to recognize some of this discussion about the situation in Ukraine. The Biden administration sent $650 million in aid, military assistance and aid, to the Ukrainian government in the last year, far surpassing anything that was done in the Trump administration. In fact, we spent many hours here on the floor of the United States Senate in an impeachment proceeding based on what many of us thought was the attempt by then President Trump to use military aid to extract a political concession from President Zelensky. That's quite a stark difference than what President Biden's administration has been doing for the last year. There's a reference made to dealing with Saudi Arabia. Well, President Trump's first trip overseas was to Saudi Arabia to cavort with his friends, the princes and the kings of Saudi Arabia. His son-in-law made multiple trips over there. And it wasn't in the spirit of condemnation, it was in a spirit of business-like behavior, I'd say. Khashoggi was killed by agents of MSB, the Crown Prince, but the details in the report were never released by the Trump administration. President Biden released those details, earning, I think, the enmity of the Crown Prince. So this story of the ineffectuality of the Biden administration is completely, in my view, without base. What we've seen, and I think the senator from Connecticut recognizes it as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, probably the most sophisticated development of an alliance to oppose tyranny that we've seen in many, many years. When the whole world is united by the diplomacy of this administration to stand up against Vladimir Putin, and I must say, practically the whole world. That's an amazing demonstration of diplomacy, statesmanship, and it happened because of the leadership of the president, the leadership of Secretary Blinken, the leadership of Secretary Austin. And again, when you have Switzerland joining in sanctioning a country, the greatest neutral nation in the world, that's a remarkable accomplishment. We still have a long way to go. The outcome is still very much uncertain. But to date, the president and his administration has done an extraordinary job. Afghanistan is an issue that we have dealt with for 20 years. And one of the first things we did was to ensure that in the National Defense Authorization Act, there was an independent study, which will be conducted. But it's not going to focus on the last 2 weeks. It's going to focus on the 20 years. It's going to assess whether the decision to invade Iraq was a critical strategic mistake, which I think it was. That's why I opposed it originally. It's going to look at the Doha Agreement, in which the Trump administration basically said, we're leaving, which gave the Taliban one of their greatest psychological and indeed, in a way, military weapons, because as they went from village to village and said, here it is, signed, sealed, and delivered, they're leaving. And when they go, who are you going to be with? Ghani or us? And the answer too often was us. So in any way to estimate sort of the culpability, the responsibility of our role in Afghanistan, it will take that kind of 20-year look by independent experts who are concerned to find the truth, not to find political arguments. So, Mr. President, I'm just very disappointed that we're going to continue to avoid our duty to ensure that there are civilians in the Department of Defense that are able to carry out the policy of the United States, which is the basic principle of civil-military relations in the United States and in the Constitution of the United States. But, Mr. President, retaining my time, I'd now like to resume my comments with respect to the energy situation and the United States. As I indicated previously, the invasion of Ukraine has revealed the vulnerability that our dependence on oil creates for our economy and for average Americans trying to fill up their cars and pay their heating bills. The fact is, the United States has sufficient domestic production to meet our energy needs today. We're producing more oil and refined product than ever before. Oil production was up more than 500,000 barrels a day from January to December of last year, and is expected to rise even more this year, which I would assume would mean that more and more Americans are working in the oil fields and elsewhere. In fact, I believe last year the workforce grew to about 6.6 million jobs, which we hadn't seen in the last year or two of the Trump administration. Unemployment now is hovering around 4%. Gross domestic product has been significant, much more so than the preceding several years. But we do have problems economically, and some of those problems are related to the international oil supply. Now, we certainly don't need Russian oil, and I have said we should stop importing it, and I'm glad that this morning the President announced the United States will officially ban the importation of oil from Russia, denying Putin a key revenue source for his illegal war. This is something both Democrats and Republicans have called for, and the American people should know this policy choice will likely affect the price of gasoline. But even if we don't use Russian oil, everyone needs to know that petroleum is traded on the world market, and the U.S. is part of that world market. The chaos Putin is sowing in Europe will continue to have an effect here, regardless of where we get our oil. Our energy policy of over-reliance on fossil fuel is a matter of national security, and it's time we embrace all that entails. And the reality of a world market combined with the impact on regular Americans who need to fill up their car, means the United States will have to make some tough choices on who we buy from if we're not buying from Russia. We will have to more carefully consider what we are exporting, how we will prevent profiteering, and what pain people should expect at the pump. If the climate crisis, raging fires, historic droughts, and flooding aren't enough to convince my colleagues on the other side of the aisle of the need to kick our oil addiction, I hope the national security and economic vulnerabilities exposed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be enough. As long as we base our energy future on oil, we choose to make ourselves vulnerable. Unfortunately, many of my Republican colleagues don't seem to recognize that reality. Instead, they focus on never-built pipelines geared towards exporting oil, not using here in the United States. Most of that oil that was going through the pipeline that President Biden, I think because of many, many considerations, decided against, was destined for exportation, not used in the United States. Or they make claims about any production under Democratic presidents that either contort or suspend reality. It's time, to borrow the phrase of my Rhode Island colleagues in the White House, it's time to wake up. Indeed, the solution to higher gas prices is more oil dependency. The bottom line is that we need to accelerate the transition to clean, renewable energy sources that aren't subject to worldwide scarcity and manipulation by our adversaries. There are, however, things we should do in the short term to help consumers. And again, the advocates for the oil companies, the advocates for special tax arrangements, the advocates to continue to pump oil and pump oil and pump oil are playing right, in my sense, into the hands of a Putin. Because if our world economy is based on hydrocarbons, then Russia is going to make some money. If our world economy is based on other sources of power, alternative sources of power, then his cash register is going to ring close to zero. And I'm pleased that President Biden listened to me and others in Congress and decided to tap into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help bring down the price of oil. He wisely coordinated the release of 60 million barrels with our international partners. The action sends a reassuring signal to markets, but we may need to release more to tamp down prices. We also need to insist that our Middle East partners do more to increase production to help stabilize prices and meet demand in Europe. We should also ask domestic oil and gas producers to pitch in. Despite the other sides of the aisle's claims about the economy, big oil is earning some of its highest profits in years. They're not simply passing on the additional cost to the consumer reluctantly and grudgingly and sadly. ExxonMobil and Chevron, for example, reported combined net annual profits of nearly $38.6 billion in 2021. But are they investing those profits in new production, particularly when they have 14 million acres in unused leases? No. Instead, they are issuing higher dividends and buying back stock to boost share prices. These windfall profits should be used to help consumers, not their billionaire investors. Of course, the easiest way to insulate ourselves from higher costs is to become more energy efficient. When we consume less, we pay less. It's why I've long advocated better fuel economy standards for cars and trucks, something that the last administration worked against. Yes, the Trump administration tried to derail an increase in gas mileage that the automobile companies were in favor of. Even when automakers said we should keep the toughest standards, Trump said no. Why? Let's be more dependent on gasoline. There's not only this country's oil producers will benefit, guess what? Putin will benefit, and others will benefit. Fortunately, the Biden administration has a broader vision for a clean energy future that eases the burden on consumers. While there's much more to do, the bipartisan infrastructure law took important steps on this front. It invests $7.5 billion to build out a national network of electric vehicle chargers, $5 billion for electric buses, and $90 billion to improve public transit systems. It also includes $65 billion to upgrade our power infrastructure, including by building thousands of miles of new resilient transmission lines to facilitate the expansion of renewable energy. And we can't just look at transportation because consumers are also facing the pinch on home energy prices. And last year, I worked to secure $4.5 billion in the American Rescue Plan for the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program to help consumers pay their energy bills. In the coming days, we will pass an omnibus appropriations bill to provide base funding for that program, which still lacks the resources to help all who qualified for assistance. But we need to do more. We also need to make other long-term investments. In his State of the Union address last week, President Biden emphasized the need to weatherize homes and businesses to be more energy efficient, which in turn lowers energy cost and reduces greenhouse gases emissions. And I cannot agree more. It's why I've led the fight to fund the Weatherization Assistance Program, which received $3.5 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law. This program has helped more than 7 million low-income families reduce their energy bills by making their homes more energy efficient. It saves participants nearly $300 in energy bills a year, and a Department of Energy study found that in 1 year it reduced carbon emissions.
Members, please take their conversations off the floor. Senators recognized.
Thank you. It reduced carbon emissions by more than 2.2 million metric tons, the equivalent to taking more than 500,000 cars off the road. To make the most of this investment, this week I introduced the Weatherization Assistance Program Improvement Act along with Senators Collins, Coons, and Shaheen. Our bill would make critical updates, including increasing eligibility, raising the per-unit funding level for weatherization projects, and setting aside funding to make critical health and safety repairs in conjunction with weatherization projects. Together, these reforms will make the program more effective and will help to serve even more households across the country. These are significant steps, but we need the full package of climate and energy reforms that the President has been calling for, including tax credits and grants that would make energy cleaner, vehicles cleaner, and other clean technology more affordable and competitive. If we do these things, we will make a huge difference in the lives of Americans today and for generations to come. And just a final thought, Mr. President, I think one of the greatest nightmares that Vladimir Putin has is a world that is powered by electricity, not generated by hydrocarbons, a world in which the gasoline, the oil that he has in Russia is not worth $150 a barrel, but $1.50 a barrel. We can do it. And it'll be one of the most significant national security endeavors when we accomplish that. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.